evening, everybody. My name is Aaron Devor, and I have the good fortune of holding the position of the chair in Transgender Studies here at the University of Victoria. Tonight, you're really here to find out more about the amazing Martine Rothblatt. She received an Honorary Doctor of Laws yesterday from the University of Victoria, and tonight I'm going to spend some time asking her some questions and allowing us to find a little bit of depth about the many amazing things she's done. And so I'd like to, by way of introduction, show you a short video to give you a little bit of a feel for what we're going to be talking about.
I think we all have to be very skeptical about people who say that there are limits to what people can do. Human beings are the species that transcend their limits.
There isn't often that someone has published books in the following categories: satellite communications, gender differences, genetic engineering, organ transplantation, and Middle East peace.
And I can honestly say, I don't think I have come across anybody as successful and inspirational as Martine.
While it took like 10 years to birth the company and launch the satellites, today there's hundreds of channels of music that people can listen to coast to coast. She was diagnosed to have a rare, almost invariably fatal disease called pulmonary arterial hypertension. I became an expert on the condition. A doctor said to me, "Martine, we are not going to be able to find a cure in time to save your daughter. However, there is a medicine. You could use your expertise in satellite communications to develop this cure for pulmonary hypertension." The astonishing thing is that this absolutely worthless piece of powder that had the sparkle of a promise of hope for Genesis is not only keeping Genesis and other people alive today, but produces almost $1.5 billion a year in revenue. So I thought, well, why don't we take these lungs out of the dying body and put them in a kind of an artificial body where they have none of the toxic chemicals associated with the processes of death, with this brand new procedure called ex vivo lung perfusion. We now do this every day, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We've already saved hundreds of patients' lives. Just like we keep cars and planes and buildings going forever with an unlimited supply of building parts, why can't we create an unlimited supply of transplantable organs to keep people living? So we've teamed up with the decoder of the human genome to genetically modify the pig genome, and so that the pig's organs will not be rejected by the human body, and thereby to create an unlimited supply of transplantable organs. I felt my soul was always female and as a woman, but I was afraid people would laugh at me if I expressed it. So I always kept it bottled up. and just showed my male side. Separate male or female genders is a constructed fiction. The reality is a gender fluidity that crosses the entire continuum from male to female.
What will be feasible as we go forward 5, 10, 20 years in biotechnology?
We're extending everyone's lifespans with regenerative medicine, with personalized medicine, and people have an unlimited amount of desire and willpower to extend their life. This desire and willpower will be channeled into economic forces to propel biotechnology till we achieve, well before the end of this century, the death of death.
So please join me in welcoming Martine Rothblatt. So Martine, thank you so much for joining us. And I have to start by telling you that my grandson is extremely jealous that he couldn't be here. He really wanted to be here with us. And I wanted to start with talking a little bit about family. I know that you and Bina have been married for close to 40 years. For anybody, that is an amazing feat. And I've heard that you have a special little name that you use for the two of you. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your secret of how you keep a relationship strong for that long.
Well, first, Aaron, thank you very much for welcoming me here. It's my second time being here in this auditorium and on the beautiful UVic campus. And I'm now seeing this trip more and more Vancouver Island than I saw before. So it definitely is becoming like a destination place for me. And it seems you could spend like decades and not explore all the places that there are to explore in Vancouver Island. You guys are so lucky to live here and just in British Columbia. So if your grandson is envious of you being here with me, I'm envious of you guys living here in beautiful British Columbia.
You are invited to join us.
I'm trying bit by bit. So there's really no secret to Bina and I. It was love at first sight. She's in the audience today with my daughter and son, and we did fall in love when we first saw each other, and we just kind of mind melded, you know, like everything that was like part of my way of looking at reality was complementary to her way. And sometimes I think maybe it wasn't like just like conscious level mind melding. Sometimes I think it was on a pheromonic level. You know, the first part of the brain to develop was actually the olfactory brain. And, you know, that's like I've seen, you know, pictures like of like a dog's brain, and it's like half of it, you know, is the olfactory section. But even if we don't have half of our brain, there's still like a core, a deep, deep core. And I think it's very powerful because it actually bypasses all of your conscious gatekeeping. So all of these, you know, pheromones that are unique to Bina, they just match so well with all the pheromones that are unique to me. And we just fit together like puzzle pieces, Aaron. It's not hard to stay married, it's natural.
Anybody who has met Bina would know that she is a remarkable and lovely person. So. Sorry, Bina, I had to embarrass you just a little bit. You're not up on stage with us. Okay, thank you very much. So in the video, we saw little snippets of a lot of the things you've done. And of course, I think everybody has heard of Sirius Radio, SiriusXM, and that's had a big influence on a lot of people's lives. But you left Sirius, and you started something new, United Therapeutics. Can you tell us a little bit of the story about why you left Sirius and started United Therapeutics?
Sure. Sirius is a great company, and it was really the natural epitome of my life, my career direction, because I became obsessed with satellite communications and uniting the world through satellite communications when I was in college. And then to be able to actually be doing it with real satellites in geostationary orbit and millions of people being tied together, this is like perfect. But then we went on a family skiing vacation one year, and our daughter Sunny, who's here, was with us. And our younger daughter, Genesis, who's our youngest child, she had gone skiing before, but perhaps she had never gone quite up to the 7,000, 7,500 foot level where we were at. And she got very short of breath. She lost all desire to go outside. Her lips turned blue, kind of the more medical term is kind of like cyanotic. She became prone to fainting. And we went a round robin to so many different doctors to try to figure out what was wrong. We finally found ourselves, we lived in a suburb of Washington, D.C., which is where Sirius was first founded. And we found ourselves at Children's National Medical Center in front of a doctor who was the chairman of pediatric cardiology. So this is like getting, super specific, super specialized. And he says, your daughter has a fatal illness. It only occurs in about 1 out of every 1 million people. The life expectancy is 3 to 5 years. And I'm going to send you for a referral to the lung transplant department, because that's the only cure for it. However, lung transplants are very hard to get, and to get one the size of your daughter, I mean, she wasn't even like 100 pounds then, it's not very likely. So Bean and I, we were crying, obviously, and devastated, and so our daughter had to be in the intensive care ward, and Bean and I would tag team watching the other kids while one of us would stay with Genesis. And when she'd be asleep, I'd go down into the library because there really was not like a well-developed Wikipedia or web at that time. And Netscape, for those of you who are like internet history buffs, was
or just old.
So I learned from reading about it what exactly the disease was, and that I began to see a glimmer of possibility that I would be able to develop a medicine even though there were no medicines approved for it and everybody died from it. But I knew I would have to throw myself into it 1,000%. I meet a lot of entrepreneurs because, like these two great entrepreneurs right in front of me today, but I meet a lot of entrepreneurs because they know I'm an entrepreneur, and I tell people you cannot be a part-time entrepreneur. I'm not going to say it would never work out, but it's already the odds are against you as an entrepreneur, and like the odds just slip like way against you if you're a part-time entrepreneur. You have to say that this is the most important thing you'll do in your life. This is the purpose of your life, is to succeed with your mission. And so I knew if I was to be able to find a cure where no pharmaceutical companies had found a cure, no doctors had found a cure, I would have to throw myself completely into it. Even though I do love space technology, as you could see from the wonderful video put together by Michael, thank you, Michael. I'm a Trekkie, and 7 of 9 is kind of like my alter ego. So I loved having a space company. I loved having satellites that were 1/6 of the way to the moon. But I knew I'd have to put all that aside and throw my entire life into saving Genesis. So that's why I left Sirius.
And the company, United Therapeutics, was devoted to finding the cure for pulmonary hypertension, which is what Genesis was diagnosed with. And you did eventually find an effective treatment. Can you tell us the story about how you went from looking it up on Netscape to coming up with a treatment when you were a satellite radio person?
It was very, very difficult, Aaron, because what happens is the drug development business is so ridiculously complicated. I tell people all the time, Sirius wasn't the first satellite that I launched, and I said, people think launching satellites into space is risky. It's actually not nearly as risky as trying to develop a medicine and get it approved by Health Canada or the FDA. It's just insanely complicated, and probably for very good reason. Because when you launch satellites, and then you have to create radios for people to listen to the satellites or watch the video. I mean, people can buy it or they don't buy it. And whether they buy it or not buy it, it's probably not going to really affect their health in any way. But when you're creating a medicine, you're creating like a string of molecules that have never evolved anywhere on the face of the planet. And, you know, humans are the offspring of like 3 billion-year-old bacteria and, you know, 1.5 billion-year-old eukaryotic cells, and then billion-year-old worms, and, you know, 100 million-year-old mammals, and, you know, so on and so forth. And all this chemistry has been very carefully fine-tuned by nature to work together. And our bodies are really comprised of literally millions of locks and keys. And the keys fit like right into the locks. And if they don't, that's when people develop illnesses and diseases. But most of the time, for most of the people, everything just works like clockwork. And so here you go, and you have these people in the white jackets, white lab coats and whatnot, and they concoct some chemical and say, okay, I'm going to put it in these people. Well, maybe first they may give it to rats or mice, but you know, we are 100 million years biochemically removed from the rats and mice, so that's not going to be like a sure-telling thing that it will work or not. And the odds of doing harm are actually vastly greater than the odds of doing good. However, despite that, human ingenuity has developed, you know, all kinds of compounds that do all kinds of good and amazing things. So many of them are natural compounds, and we've been able to identify or really build on native people's knowledge of natural compounds that work very well for us. Other times, people come up with novel compounds. So what I found out was that there was this novel compound at a giant pharmaceutical company. It's now called Glaxosmithkline and GSK in the UK, and that they had developed this molecule, but they decided not to ever go developing it to actually help people, because they tested it in heart failure, which affects millions of people, and it didn't work in heart failure. Not surprising, it's a lock and key thing. You know, the odds are these things aren't going to work. On the plus side, it didn't kill the people, so that was like lucky. What they noted, and I found this in the most obscurest of journal articles, and that's why, you know, I really encourage people who are researchers, you know, my method is like read an article and then look at the references that they cite at the back of the article, and then go up and look up all of those references and read all of them. I know it's a lot of work, but still read all of them, and look at all the references that they cite, and just keep doing this process until you get to a point of diminishing returns, because you've kind of covered the field. So, so it turned out that in this obscure article that I found like 4 steps down the read references, read all the references, read all the references, like 4 steps down, I find this article. They tested it in these people with heart failure, didn't work at all, didn't kill them, but the one thing it did is it reduced these heart failure patients' pulmonary artery pressure and left the whole rest of the body alone. And it's like, whoa, that was like exactly my daughter's problem. All the rest of her body was fine, but just the pulmonary artery, which is the artery that takes blood from your heart to your lungs. And all the other arteries in your body go from the heart to the rest of the body. But the pulmonary artery goes from the heart to the lungs. And as a result, it's the only artery in the body that carries deoxygenated blood. All the other arteries in the body, they get fresh air, fresh oxygenated blood from the lungs. It pours into your heart pumps, and fresh oxygenated blood goes down to your little pinky toe and your earlobe and everywhere in between. But the pulmonary artery is the only one that has deoxygenated blood, because somehow the blood has to get back to the lungs to get fresh oxygen. So this molecule took advantage of that one phenotypic difference in the pulmonary arteries. And I went down to the company, GSK, and I said, please, will you develop this medicine for my daughter? She's dying of pulmonary artery hypertension. They said, no, we won't. We only develop medicines for blockbuster conditions that, tens or hundreds of thousands of people. We're very sorry about your daughter, but there's only like 1 in a million people have this disease. It would never cover the costs of developing it. So I said, is there any way? They said, well, we really don't think so, but maybe if you formed a specific company and if you had a business plan and you showed us how this might be worthwhile. So I did all that, and I went back there, and I said, well, your business plan is that this will make maybe like $50 million, and, that's not enough for a big pharmaceutical company. It'll cost more than that to make it. I says, no. I said, is there anything I could do? They said, well, maybe if you got some real scientists who knew what they were doing and knew how to turn our powder into a real medicine, some key opinion leaders, thought leaders. We enjoy your Sirius radio, and we're sorry about your daughter. Everybody's sorry about your daughter, but can't help you. So I went and I found all those people. I was like a person on a mission. I found all those experts. I even found like a Nobel Prize winner who agreed to join me because one of my other satellite systems tracked elephants in Africa, and he was just fascinated when I showed him a map with elephants moving on Africa. He loved it, so he said he would help me. He was British, and they have something for Africa. I don't know exactly what it is. I guess Canada too, but in any event, so I went back there, and now this was like every couple months I'm darkening their door, and I meet the head of all research and development. His name was Bob Bell. He's still around, very nice person. And he says, Martine, you would not believe what happened since you were last here. And he said, by the way, congratulations on all you've accomplished building up a company. You have some real drug developers, some real scientists. He said, my sister, who lives in Nebraska, was diagnosed with secondary pulmonary hypertension. So it's similar to what my daughter had, but not the same. If you have some other diseases, like lupus is one, maybe some of you know somebody who has lupus. Scleroderma is another one. Maybe some of you know somebody with scleroderma. There's about like a half dozen different diseases. But if you have these other diseases, you end up getting pulmonary hypertension as a consequence of that main disease. So he said his sister had one of those secondary causes of pulmonary hypertension. He said he went up to the CEO of Glaxosmithkline and said, hey, I really have a reason for us to develop this medicine now. My sister has it. CEO said, look, I'm sorry about your sister. Everybody's always very sorry. I'm sorry about your sister, but it's not enough of a market. We can't do it. He said, Martine, you've put together more than I thought you would, and I will be your product champion in this company to argue that we can't do it ourselves. I can't get the CEO to do it, but maybe I'll get the CEO to agree to sell it to you. So Bob Bell did that. He worked all the channels inside Glaxo, and Glaxo agreed to sell us the compound, these molecules, for $25,000 and a 10% royalty on any sales we might make. And then when we signed all the documents, they gave me the actual powder. And it was in a Ziploc baggie. It looked like cocaine, really. I mean, that's what it looked like. And they said, no matter what, don't give this to anybody. It's beyond its shelf life. It's no longer stable or safe. The only way to make this molecule is completely impractical, and it would violate some EPA guidelines because of the huge amount of waste. So you're going to have to find your own way to make it. You can't use this for anything. And by the way, it only will last in the blood for 45 minutes, and it has to be given continuously. So you're going to have to come up with a kind of a delivery system that delivers this medicine 24 hours a day to a person. And it's like, I felt like,
Really?
I really felt like fainting, to tell you the truth, because I felt like, shit, I went through all this enormous hassle, and it's like, I got it, but I got nothing.
Yeah.
And so believe it or not, even though it took me a long time to explain all that, that was really the beginning of the story.
Okay, well, take us through a couple of more steps then, because we know that Genesis is alive and healthy.
Yes. So the end of the story is I was able to, first of all, find a chemist after checking 50 different chemistry companies and graduate chemistry departments. Dr. Robert Moriarty, he was the chairman of chemistry at the University of Illinois, and he thought that if I gave them a grant, that he might be able to find a way to synthesize the molecule in a way that we could make enough of it so people could use it. He succeeded in that. I found a company down in California. It's called MiniMed. It was a company created by one of the great med tech inventors of the 20th century, a guy named Al Mann. And so Al Mann had developed a pump. His daughter was a diabetic, insulin-dependent diabetic, and he didn't want his daughter to have to giving herself shots all the time. So he developed a small device, maybe half the size of a pack of cigarettes, that you would put insulin in there, and it would pour it under your skin 24 hours a day, and you could push some buttons to adjust the dose. If you just ate a meal, you could give yourself a little bolus dose of insulin. So I went to him and I said, could I have this thing re-engineered, just a little bit tweaked to work for our medicine, which was called Remodulin. So he agreed with that. So I found a delivery system. I found a way to manufacture the drug, did a clinical trial. I proved statistically that it definitely positively worked and helped the people with pulmonary hypertension. And so the FDA approved it. It's approved in Health Canada. It's available, coast to coast in Canada and the United States. And not only is our daughter alive and healthy, but countless thousands, many, thousands upon thousands of other people are now healthy, and they do everything from snowboarding to running for mayor and going on with having babies and, going on with their whole life thanks to this medicine that everybody thought was completely impossible.
This is a fabulous gift that you've given to everyone.
Well, I didn't really give it to anybody. It's a whole network of society that made this possible. You can't really just come up with anything in your garage anymore and just give it to people, because most of the time you probably end up killing them. So it's important to have Health Canada. Yeah. It's important to have the FDA. Once you have these institutions, they're going to develop a lot of rules and regulations for what is a valid clinical trial, what isn't a valid clinical trial. So it's a cast of thousands, really, involved.
How long did it take to get to the point where you had a drug that you could get licensed?
So we were very fortunate that the whole thing from beginning to end took under 5 years. And generally, you'll hear some publicity, mostly put out by the largest pharmaceutical companies, that it takes 10 years and $1 billion to develop a new medicine. We were able to do this in 5 years and about $100 million. So we were able to do it much more quickly, mostly because we were entrepreneurial. We're still an entrepreneurial company. We don't have so many departments. There's only 2 or 3 layers between the CEO and anybody in the company. So but most pharmaceutical companies, they have 100,000 people. So everything is, the more people you have, the slower things take. And we're much quicker. But I did learn something from this experience, Aaron. And I'm not saying don't take this literally, because I have no way to prove whether it's literally true or not. But it is a vector in the direction of truth. It's an arrow pointing in the direction of truth that cures for most of the uncured illnesses in the world right now, I believe are in the refrigerators and freezers of big pharmaceutical companies throughout the world. And just like our medicine was sitting there. And had we not done everything we did, it would still be sitting there to this day.
And they leave it sitting there because they couldn't see that they could make enough profit off of it. But now you've got this company that has made lots of money. I've heard you say that Glaxosmithkline has also made quite a bit of money off of this.
Yeah, they've now told me that Dr. Bell, he told me this was the best product that SmithKline Glaxo ever licensed to anybody. And they didn't want to do it.
Because of the 10% that
They
keep
get the
getting fed back.
10% every year, 10% of $1 billion every year. It adds up pretty fast.
It's a lot of money, 10% of $1 billion. So I understand that this drug is actually pretty expensive for the patients. So how much does it cost, and how do people manage to afford it?
So first of all, the good thing about being Canadian is it costs half the price in Canada as it does in the U.S.
Okay.
So that's I think, everybody here in Canada should be very proud of Health Canada and very proud of the healthcare system that exists here, in that not only are medicines approved, but they're approved at a price that, seems reasonable for the value and the benefit provided. Not to mention the fact that essential medicines like these, the costs are completely covered by the government, so nobody has to worry about being bankrupted. You guys are really blessed in so many ways to be Canadians, but I think the healthcare system is definitely very, very high on the list. In the United States, this medicine costs, if what the insurance companies and Medicare pay for it, is $100,000 per patient per year. So it's a very expensive medicine. And we decided from the very first day that it was approved that anybody that could not pay for this medicine would get it for free. And in fact, we went further and we said that anybody that had health insurance, so not every American has health insurance, so those without health insurance just get it for free and have always gotten it for free. But a lot of people have what I would call bad health insurance, namely like it's the amount of the health insurance is so little that it could get used up and then you don't have it anymore. So we said that if anybody had health insurance and the amount left in their health insurance was only enough for a lung transplant, then they still would get our medicine for free, so that if they needed a lung transplant after using our medicine, they would have enough health insurance for that.
That's great.
And it's been that policy, throughout the world. Before the current, past 5 years, for example, of Israel-Gaza problems, we had 2 patients that lived in Gaza, and they would come to the Israeli border and get the medicine for free.
Fabulous. And how do people find out that they can get it for free? Their physicians tell them that? Is that how they get that information?
So generally what happens is the physicians will write a prescription, and then on the prescription there's like an 800 number to call, and that number is called the Assist Center, and that's where we have about 30 people who were, I think they're almost all were nurses at one time, and their whole purpose is to help the patient get the medicine. So they'll be the ones who figure it out.
So those are people in your company that
Yes.
assist them. That's great. That's great. Now, you mentioned a moment ago that people often need lung transplants.
Yes.
And we showed in the video some of the work you've been doing with the ex vivo lungs. I understand that there's a Canadian connection in there, and I'd like you to tell us a little bit about how that process works and what the Canadian connection is.
Yes, so one of the things I do is I travel around and I talk to different doctors who are treating the patients, and I ask them, is there anything better we could be doing? Is there anything new you think we can be doing? How can we be, helping the patients live better lives? Or are there other similar illnesses that you think we should be focusing on? And one of the doctors, her name's Adani Frost. She was at, I think it was Texas Methodist or Texas Baptist, some big hospital down there. She told me, well, one thing that you should do, Martine, is that you should link up with Dr. Shav Keshauji at the Toronto General Hospital, because he's figured out a way to greatly increase the number of lungs available for transplantation. So I said, well, that's great, Adani, I'll do that. And so I traveled to Toronto and met with Dr. Keshauji. For those of you who may not know, one thing that is another very special point of distinction for Canada is that the first lung transplant in the world was done in Canada. And a lot of people know, like, oh, the first heart was like South Africa, and the first kidney, I think it was like at Mass Gen and there, but the first heart, the first lung, was at Toronto General Hospital. And the lung is the most difficult of those major thoracic organs to transplant because 10 years transpired between the heart transplant and the first lung transplant. That's how complicated and tricky it was. People couldn't figure it out. But it was figured out at TGH, Toronto General Hospital, and the first double lung transplant was also done at Toronto General Hospital. Some of you may know, by the way, that insulin was, first developed at Toronto General Hospital. So amazing medical institution there. I met with Dr. Khashoggi. He's like an amazing guy. And he told me that he had, jury-rigged this system at Toronto General Hospital, and he was able to take lungs that nobody else would take and successfully transplant them into people by putting them in this jury-rigged artificial body or ex vivo body. And I said, well, Shaf, this is amazing. How can I bring this to lots and lots of places? And he said, well, what was needed was to build a centralized center that all different hospitals could send their bad lungs to, and then you could give the transplant doctors anywhere they were in North America, if you could build a high-speed data link so that they could see for themselves by looking through a bronchoscope down the bronchi of this dead lung being revived inside an artificial body and see for themselves that that lung was now good enough to transplant into a body. Of course, a transplant surgeon, they're going to be understandably hesitant. They've got a patient, by definition, on death's door, and they don't want to put like a lung that's chock full of mucus and got tears in it. I mean, that would be insane. So they want to be sure that the lung is pristine. But you could show them, telecommunicating-wise, that the lung is pristine, and then they'll accept it, and you then would cool it down again and reship it to them. So nobody had ever done this before because the accepted wisdom of organ transplantation is that there's only so many hours that an organ can be out of a body, and then it's no good. And it's always like less than 10 hours. 10 hours out of the body, then it's no good. And it can only be cooled down once for shipment and then warmed up. But to do what Dr. Khashoggi was asking, we had to ship it once, so that kind of used up most of that 10 hours. Then we had to work on it under this glass dome for another several hours. Then which meant we had to warm it up and work on the glass dome. Then we had to cool it down again. And then we had to ship it for another, depending how far the hospital was, 4, 6, 8, 10 hours. But we did it, and we've done it successfully, and hundreds of lives have been saved with this technology. So the number of people who get lung transplants now is quite a bit larger than it was just a few years ago, thanks to our commercialization of Dr. Khashoggi's technology.
Fantastic. And you work with the Mayo Clinic on this?
Yes, so when the Mayo Clinic heard about this, they got very excited, and they have 3 Mayo Clinics, one in Arizona, one in Rochester, Minnesota, and one in Jacksonville, Florida, and they asked us to build an additional one of these centralized centers to be used by the 3 Mayo Clinics.
Fabulous. So you're rehabilitating. First, you're saving people who are dying by giving them these medicines. Then you're rehabilitating lungs for those that need a lung transplant. Then you started doing something with pigs. Tell us about what's going on there.
Yes, so despite the fact that we're rehabilitating these lungs, which is very good, and we're increasing the number of people who have lung transplants, once I got into this lung transplant area, I kind of had a big problem of cognitive dissonance, you could say, is I wondered, well, like, how many people actually need lung transplants? And so I looked to see how many people were dying. I looked online, how many people were like dying of lung failure or heart failure. I was like shocked. It was like 250,000 people a year die of end-stage pulmonary disease, so lung failure, mostly COPD and emphysema, but stuff like pulmonary fibrosis, cystic fibrosis, pulmonary hypertension, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, all kind of different things. And that's not even including the people who die of lung cancer. So that's the cancer people, it's like above and beyond the 250,000. More than 500,000 people a year die of heart failure. Yet only 2,000 lung transplants are done a year, and about 3,000 heart transplants are done a year. In Canada, those figures are about a tenth. So I'm giving you the figures for the US. In Canada, those figures are about a tenth. So it seemed very curious to me, why, are there so few transplants being done when so many people need them? So the first thought that came to my mind was that, well, it's because people haven't agreed to donate their organs. So I began to research that, and I saw that more than 50% of Americans, and I would guess it's a comparable number of Canadians, have already signed organ donor cards saying that we agreed to donate our organs. And even if someone has not signed a donor organ card, when they're asked by organ transplant professionals upon the untimely death of one of their relatives, more than 3/4 of the people say, yes, we'll agree to donate the organs. So it could not be that it was the shortage of organs available, because about, in the US, roughly speaking, 2 million people die each year. So like half of that would be 1 million people. So there should be like 1 million organs available, but only 2,000, lungs, 3,000 hearts, very small percentage. So what I found out was that organ transplantation really only works when people die of what's called brain death, when they have some kind of a stroke or other form of death, that their heart is still beating, but they're in the hospital, and the doctor says, there's like, we check their brain, and their brain is like flatlined, but their heart's still beating. So those people's organs are used about 75% of the time, but that represents only 1% of the way people die. 99% of the people die, they die because their heart stops, and generally outside of a hospital. And by the time anybody goes to get their organs, too long of a time has transpired. So just using the organ donor network was never going to close this gap between the 2,000 or 3,000 people with lung and hearts and the 250,000 or 500,000 people who needed it. So I realized that there was a need to manufacture these lungs and hearts. And I had remembered, Aaron, that my grandmother, she needed a heart valve replaced. And they gave her a heart valve from a pig. So at first I thought, oh, well, like you could just use like the pig's organs. But then I learned that when they give you a heart valve from a pig, they don't actually give you the pig's heart valve. They give you the shape of the pig's heart valve. And they put it through a bath where they take all the cells off the shape of the valve. So there's nothing that interacts with your immune system. It's just what's called the collagen scaffold of the heart valve, or the underlying shape that has no living cells on it, no bacteria on it, no nothing on it. It so happens that the pig's heart valve is the exact same size as human heart valve, so they can do that. But you can't give like a pig's actual heart valve or their actual heart, because your immune system will very rapidly reject it within a matter of actually an hour, okay? And it'll just turn into a big glob of mess. So the human genome had just been decoded in 1999, 2000, and I thought, well, why don't we decode, now that we know the human genome, why don't we do the same thing for the pig genome, decode the pig genome, figure out exactly which parts of the pig genome are fighting with the human genome, and replace those parts of the pig genome that are fighting with the human genome, either just knock them out or replace them with human genes that would do the same function. So we've been doing that in the 2010s, since the 2010s, I mean. We've been doing that, and I would say that we're now within a couple years of being able to have an unlimited supply of transplantable organs from pigs into people. And my hope and quest is to do so with even less immunosuppression than people currently have to take when they take an organ from just another person.
So we're going to have pig farms, and instead of harvesting bacon, we're going to be harvesting human organs or usable organs.
Yeah, I think that's inevitably will happen, Aaron. To give you again a sense of just the arithmetic here, and I apologize just for using the U.S. figures, the ones more on the top of my head. Americans eat 100 million pigs a year, just a totally insane number. As if you were to supply everybody in North America with the kidneys, livers, hearts, lungs, etc., that would use up 1 million pigs. So it would use up like 1% of all of the pigs. So I think that that's a feasible solution, but it's not really my preferred solution.
How soon do we expect to see that happening?
I believe that you'll see the first people's lives being saved with the medical term for it is a xenotransplant, X-E-N-O. The first people's lives saved with a xenotransplant within the next couple years.
Fantastic. But you want to go the next step. And so I heard you talking about the scaffolding and the collagen scaffolding, and I know you've got a project going on that. So tell us about that next step.
Yes, so the about 2 years after the human genome was decoded, a scientific group over in Japan figured out a way to turn a mature human cell, like a cell on your skin, back into a stem cell. And that's called an inducible pluripotent stem cell. And furthermore, this group then figured out how to re-differentiate that stem cell back into any number of different types of cells. A type of cell that lines the inside of your blood vessels, those are called endothelial cells. A kind of cell that lines your heart, those are called cardiomyocytes. So he won the Nobel Prize for this work just a few years later, and certainly deservedly so, because it was dogma in biology that cells only go one direction. They start as stem cells and they go differentiated and can never ever ever turn around and go back to become stem cells again. And just in all of our lifetime, this thing that everybody believed absolutely during the whole 20th century, wrong. So that's a cool thing about science, is you can always question authority and come up with new things. So now every decent molecular biology department in any university in the world are making iPSC, or inducible pluripotent stem cells, by the millions, and are turning them back into all different types of the 200 plus cell types that we have in our body. So that inspired me to think, well, usually when a person needs an organ, sometimes it's immediately, like they're in a car accident or something like that. So for those kind of immediate things, the pig organs would be a very good solution, because every day there'd be a fresh supply of pig organs. But most of the time people have a disease and they're told they have a year or 2 or 3 or 4, to live. And you would have time to actually grow them an organ from one of their skin cells that has exactly the same DNA as they do, looks to their body as oh, I'm the same as this person. So there's no question at all of them ever needing to use any immunosuppression at any time. And I think it's a much more sustainable approach than the xenotransplantation approach. So I've really put the top priority for our company's efforts on developing this, what I call regenerative medicine approach to creating an unlimited supply of transplantable organs.
It's fantastic. And how far along are you in that process? What stage are you at in the discovery and creation process? And when can we expect to see that happen?
Yeah, we'll definitely see it happen, Aaron, during the 2020s. This is the decade that it's going to happen. We're starting again with the lung, because that's our patients who take our medicines, they have a lung problem. And I want them to feel that the money that they have spent on the medicines is all being recycled back into coming up with an absolute cure for their disease so they won't have to take the medicine anymore. So that's the top priority. Right now, I would say it's about 2 to 3 years behind the xenotransplantation effort. So we have successfully recellularized 50% of the blood side of the lung and about 20% of the airway. So the lung, you've got like a blood side, and then you've got your bronchi, which have a different type of cells called epithelial cells, and 2 different types of them. And then you've got the air sacs, the alveolar cells. So we're about, we're more far along on the blood side, a little bit less far along on the airway side. But we've got a great team. We make really good progress, constantly. And we are growing literally hundreds of billions of cells a year from these, our starter cells that I mentioned to you. So we've become very expert at growing the cells in 3D chambers. So if somebody needed a lung, I feel very confident we can expand their cells, their endothelial and epithelial cells from a redifferentiated iPSC cell. So that part's easy. What's tricky is streaming them back into the 3D printed organ so that they'll all just code it nicely and be a breathing lung in the EVLP machine that you saw on the video before we go to transplant into a patient. So in a way, everything is kind of working together very nicely, because doing this EVLP work for the lungs that are trashed, nobody wants to use, and we bring them back to life, that is teaching us how to take a dead lung and bring it back to life. And when we're 3D printing a lung, initially it's dead, and we bring it back to life using the same techniques.
Fabulous. And once you've figured out how to do it for lungs, how far is it from there to doing it for all these other organs that people need?
It's not like another century or anything. I mean, I think, it's something that would take something on the order of perhaps another decade.
Okay, beautiful. Now, I know that you're also working on something called pharmacogenetics. Now, how does that fit into this picture that you've been making for us?
So one of the benefits, I think, of being an outsider in the pharmaceutical industry, which I'm definitely that, is that you can see things in a different light. And what I learned is that when medicines are approved, everybody knows that they're not going to work for everybody with the disease. The government officials know that they're not going to work for everybody with the disease. The drug company knows it's not going to work for everyone with the disease. And the reason they have to do very large clinical trials is so that the people that it will work for will statistically outnumber the people that drug won't work for. Now, the reason that they don't work for everybody is because everybody is not the same. We're not all clones. Like if you go in a forest, you see ferns, all those ferns are a clone, but the trees are not clones. Every tree is different, and every person is different. And these gazillion of locks and keys that are floating around in our body, they're different for each one of us. Some parts are the same, but other parts are different. So just for the same logic that some people will say, oh, if I take, Tylenol, it works for me, and somebody else will say, no, I have to take Advil, Tylenol doesn't work for me. It's the same thing with medicines. But now we have an ability to decode people's genomes. And although it cost $1 million, or I think $1 billion, $1 billion to decode the first genome back in 1999, now it only costs $1,000 to decode a genome. And people are pretty confident it'll be down to $100 in the next 5 years. So what I thought about doing is, why don't we decode the genome or sequence the genome of everybody who's in our clinical trials, and then anonymously compare who did well on our medicines with what genome unique sequences, or whether it's a fancy word for it would be polymorphisms, they had, and compare those with the polymorphisms or the unique genomic expressions in the patients in the clinical trial of who did not do well on it, or perhaps had more side effects on it. Then we could go to the FDA and say that this medicine should be approved, only for these people who have first been genetically sequenced, and they have a sequence that shows they're highly responsive to this medicine. Don't waste the time of the patients. Don't waste the healthcare system's dollars giving this medicine to the people who have genomes that the medicine we know won't work for. And some people have said to me, well, Martine, that's kind of like sacrilegious in the pharmaceutical industry, because what that means is that there'll be fewer people who end up getting prescribed that medicine, and hence fewer dollars coming in for the pharmaceutical company. But, my response is, first of all, I think, so what? I mean, it's just wrong to give medicine to somebody that's not going to help them. So, I mean, people shouldn't do that. I mean, in defense of the current pharmaceutical industry, they don't know because they never did this pharmacogenomic sequencing of everybody, so they really have no idea who it works for or not. I want to do it, so I actually will know. So it's wrong just to do it anyways. And secondly, I think it will actually help our company a lot, being known as a company that if you take a medicine from this company, it's going to definitely positively work for you, and not be one of those companies where we'll try this medicine for 6 months, and if it doesn't work, then we'll move you on to something else while your life is going tick, tick, tick away. That's pharmacogenomics.
So one more on this. Stem cells. Are you able, or do you envision being able to use them to actually cure all the diseases? I mean, we're talking about treatments up until this point. But do you see a time when you're able to use these techniques to cure disease?
Well, I certainly don't know about all diseases, Aaron. I can tell you about one stem cell clinical trial that we have going right here in Canada. And it's in partnership with the Ontario Health Research Institute. So patients with pulmonary hypertension, it's known that one of their genes does not process nitric oxide, which is an essential molecule for making your blood vessel dilate open. And generally people get their nitric oxide from eating arginine. Arginine is one of the 20 amino acids, and it's pretty much in any food that you eat has arginine. So people who have a functional gene called nitric oxide synthase, when they eat arginine, which again you get from pretty much anything you eat, then your body digests it and it sees the arginine, and your genes end up creating this thing called nitric oxide synthase. It synthesizes nitric oxide from arginine. But people with pulmonary hypertension, they don't have that. So our clinical trial is patients throughout Canada, including here in BC. They go to their hospital and they get their blood drawn, and their blood is then put into a kind of a centrifuge that separates out circulating stem cells within their blood. And these particular type of stem cells are called pre-pro-endothelial stem cells, meaning they're not like the original stem cell, but they're a stem cell that's begun to march down the direction of being an endothelial cell, which is the kind of cell that lines your blood vessels, but it's not yet there. It's still a stem cell. And so we separate these out and we fly them to Ottawa. And in Ottawa, the Canadian government has funded a big machine. And in this machine, you can modify a gene of a stem cell, all without any human hands being involved in it. And it transfects those stem cells with the corrected gene. And at the other end, you get that patient's stem cells with the corrected gene. Of course, you have to be super careful how you do this because you don't want to mix up two people's cells. But the Ottawa people have figured all of this out, and then you mail it, FedEx it, whatever, back to the patient's hospital from Quebec to BC, everywhere in between. It's reinfused in the patient, and they are able to then return their body to a natural ability to process the arginine in their food into nitric oxide, and it eliminates their pulmonary hypertension. It seems to. It's not yet, it's in a clinical trial.
Okay.
It's not yet proven, it's not yet approved, but the patients in the clinical trial who are getting this are doing very well.
So this is potentially a cure.
Our goal, the reason we're doing it is to cure the disease.
Fantastic. Okay. All of this starts to line up in the future somewhere where we may not have to die. And I know that you have some, I think you call it a religion, that you have started that is partly concerned with what is the meaning of death and where does the soul go and who are we, what is our consciousness. I'd like you to talk a little bit about some of the philosophy behind that.
So I wouldn't so much say that for the near term, it's that people would not die. I'd say that they would instead, they would die, but they would be reborn, okay, in a different form, either in a digital form or in a flesh form. And so that there would be a continuity of consciousness with their original self, so that people would be declared legally dead. Their heart will have stopped, their brain will have stopped. Some doctor or nurse would have gone in and said, I declare this person dead. But for those individuals who had backed up their indicia of their consciousness, meaning their mannerisms, their personality, their recollections, feelings, beliefs, attitudes, values, all their videos, their audios, their chats, you name it, that had all of this stored in a good place in the cloud or multiple places, that in the coming decades, there will be such souped up versions of Siri and Alexa, and these souped up versions of Siri and Alexa will be so personalized to the personality and the consciousness that's immanent in all of our digital data files, that those data files will be able to be reactivated into consciousness, and they will claim to be alive, and they will claim to be conscious. And it's my belief that sometime during this century, you could get a panel of cognitive scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals, whatever, and they'll look at the original video footage of the individual, and they'll talk in real time with the digital reconstruction of the person, and will swear on a stack of Bibles in a court of law that that reconstructed individual is the same continuous identity as the person who had died some decades before.
So let me see if I've got this right. So each of us will in some way record a record of our thoughts, our feelings, our experiences that will be preserved in some kind of cloud. The body will die, but that record will be us. And how will other people recognize that record? Will that record have a body? How would my wife know that's me?
Sure. So first of all, the only qualification I would say is not each of us, but those people who wanted to do this.
Okay.
And there will be many, many people that's like, man, I've
had enough, I'm out of here.
Had enough, that's it, And other people is like, wow, I barely got out of here dead, so, thank goodness for that. So it's not going to be everybody. And we should really always be humble and thoughtful about the fact that suicide is one of the top 10 causes of death, and it's in many ways a failure of society. So, perhaps before people spend too much energy on that kind of digital reconstruction, they should first spend a lot of time and energy dealing with the anomie and the frustration and the loneliness and the biochemical imbalances that lead our brothers and sisters and cousins and friends and neighbors to be taking their lives today. But I think to answer your question about your wife recognizing you would first of all have to consent to being revitalized. I think that ethicists would be universal in their sense that to reactivate somebody from a digital mind file without their informed consent would be an unethical thing to do. So you would have consented to this. You would have advised Lynn that you had consented to this. And so she would be aware of it. And she would be tracking the technology. It would be on the news all the time. More and more people are being revived. People are migrating from cloud storage into real reality. Many of us will have more and more friends who are in fact digital friends. And the reason I wrote my last book, Virtually Human, The Peril and Promise of Digital Immortality, is to lay out the legal case that people should not be discriminated based on their lack of a bodily form. That people can have fears, hopes, pains, pleasures, desires, aspirations, and not yet have a bodily form. So all of this will come about, and hence I think it will be, depending on your relationship with Lynn, I think she will be waiting for you with bated breath or not.
I think she insists she's going first.
Okay.
So will we, when we want to come back, if those of us who do, will some of the techniques that you're developing now allow the creation or the recreation of a facsimile body using stem cells and collagen frameworks and so on? I'm trying to picture this going on to the next stages. So would I be able to take my consciousness out of storage and replace it in a body that looks like the one I'm used to, that I'm familiar with?
Yeah, so I think, the beautiful thing about cyber resurrection of people is that I believe it'll be economically accessible to essentially everyone in the world, because software has such a low marginal cost, and just like the fact that 3/4 of the world's population is a smartphone now, that all those people have access to the world's knowledge, things like software is readily available. The largest amount of efforts of people in developing this cognitive computing type of software, or AI software, whatever you want to call it, that would resurrect our personalities, are open source hacker communities that are working together to develop this software and make it freely available to everyone. So the cyber resurrection of people will be something that's very inexpensive, and therefore I think it'll be widely available, and there'll be millions of people coming back to life as their cyber selves. So now when you talk about how many of those people would like to have a physical instantiation of themselves, I have no way of knowing that, but I suspect that some subset of all the cyber resurrected people will want to have a bodily instantiation of themselves. Not instead of their cyber self, but in addition to their cyber self. So then there's kind of two different pathways that technology is going. A fully mechanical pathway, basically a robot, like you saw the Bina 48 robot, where there's no biology in there, it's all just advanced materials that can be made. There's no reason that all of those bodies have to look like human bodies. Somebody may want to be, reinstantiated as an arbitrary form. And if you look online in some, virtual communities and game spaces, you'll see that there's a vast diversity of forms that people choose for themselves. Other people will want to have a flesh body. I personally think that a flesh body is one of the greatest creations ever, anywhere in the universe. It's amazing, the sense of touch, feel, scent, back to the pheromones. Bodies are amazing. And it so happens that a lot of technological factors are reducing all the time the cost of 3D printing flesh. One of the biggest things moving this along is the in vitro meat movement. And in vitro meat right now is very expensive. It costs something like, I believe, around $10,000 a pound. But of course, all of us realize that, kind of everything costs $10,000 a pound at one time and then came down cheap, So the Good Food Institute, I'd encourage anybody to go to their website. They're an amazing organization. I'm a part of that organization. The Good Food Institute projects that by 2050, the cost of in vitro meat will come down to $10 a pound. So that means a 150 pound person, if they were just meat, that would be like $1,500 to have a body for the mind to download back into. Now people are not just meat, we have a whole body form. But in the meantime, there's companies like mine, 3D printing hearts and lungs, and we're not the only company printing hearts and lungs. The FDA recently approved a 3D printed skin, so that's already going on. Other people are 3D printing trachea, ureters, you name it, this is a very, very popular area. So I think it's reasonable to project that at least by the end of this century, while it wouldn't be universally affordable to print a 3D body and have that body mated to a piece of electronics, say maybe appended somewhere off your vagus nerve or something, that had your cyber self from the cloud stored locally and interfaced to your brain, and then you start growing neurons fresh from the beginning again. That whole concept, it is sci-fi now, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. And just because something is science fiction doesn't mean it won't happen. In fact, it oftentimes means it will happen. So I think that's realistic by the end of this century for maybe a middle income type of person.
Great. Okay, I'm going to change gears we're going to run out of time, so I want to change gears a little bit. You've written a couple of books about gender. You have written about you mentioned in the video about fluidity and about the range, and you have proposed at one point, anyway, I don't know if you still ascribe to this, a color theory of gender. Maybe you could spend a few minutes talking about that.
Sure, I do ascribe to it. It's in the books. The classic book was The Apartheid of Sex, and the more recent one is Transgender to Transhuman. But basically, I just think gender is a social construct, and that there are an infinite number of shades of gender, just as there are an infinite number of shades of color. And we all get forced to choose male or female before we even have an ability to choose, because we're told we're male or female, we're shown male or female role models. Like I said in the video, we're laughed at and humiliated if we don't niche ourselves into those role models. But in fact, the number of people that are breaking free of male and female role models is, I think, growing exponentially. And there's a huge non-binary gender community, which is exploding, a huge queer community, which is exploding. And I do think that in this same future that I'm looking forward to with the digital revitalization and all that kind of stuff, we'll really come to a point where a majority of people will identify with arbitrary genders far beyond either male or female, and that the association of genitals from gender will be completely decoupled.
And where do the colors come into this?
Well, I like colors because colors are infinite number of shades, and a project that I proposed for, I guess it would be social psychologists mostly, would be to deconstruct what we mean by gender into different attitudes or or valence type of elements, like aggressive versus passive, whatever it is that a person wants to deconstruct gender into, and that you could then, each different pole of gender, if there could be 3, I propose in my book, but somebody else could come up with 5 or 8 or 12, whatever, could be divided into like 100 different subtypes of that. And at the end, there's like this coding system. I forget the name of it, like every color.
Pantone.
Yeah,
Pantone system.
I guess it's Pantone system, but every color has like a 4-digit number, 6-digit number. I don't know what the whole thing is. So somebody would be able to look at this, and a group of people would agree, oh, this individual is, has like a 80% chance of being a 56134 and a 20% chance of being a 2738. And that was yesterday, and today they've already shifted to another color. But instead of people saying like I'm a male, I'm a female, they might just say, to make it kind of stupidly simple, I'm mauve.
Do you have a favorite color?
Amethyst.
Amethyst. Okay, very good. You became a Canadian citizen. Why did you do that?
I like Canada.
That's simple, isn't it?
Yeah.
What do you like about Canada?
Well, first of all, I like the overall mantra of kind of unity and diversity, That's, to me, is like the highest level mantra of Canada. It's what it's been from the beginning. So that's like 90% of what I like about Canada. Beyond that, I like the fact that Canadians seem to be, in general, no place is perfect, but in general, they seem to be the most futuristic. By that I mean progressive. And instead of like living, only in ways that were harmful to each other, people in Canada in general are trying to live more in ways that are helpful to each other. So I'm still an American citizen, and I explained to the Canadian immigration people, I said, I really love Canada, I love Canadian values, I love the unity and diversity, but it's not like I hate being American. And I said, when I transitioned from male to female, it's because I've always felt female, and I identify with women, but it doesn't mean that I hate being male. I never hated being male, and I definitely don't hate men or anything like that. And I said I felt like I could become the woman that my soul was without denying the male person that was like the first 30 years of my life. And I explained all that just like that to the Canadian immigration person. I said, to me, becoming Canadian is like the next evolution of my transcendental journey. And if I said that in the US, I'm sure I would have been locked up in a cage on the Mexican border somewhere. I'd be in that cage, it'd be horrible. But Canada, she just said, cool, yeah.
That's beautiful. Final words. What message would you like to give to trans folks who are listening and watching this now and in the future?
I don't know, Aaron, that I really have a right to say that, because everything I think is contextual, and it's very important to know each person you're talking to. And it's a little bit reckless, if not dangerous, for me to give advice to people that I don't know. They're just out there and watching the stream or something. So I'd maybe like to demur from giving that advice, and just maybe ask everybody, whether they're transgendered or not transgendered, to first of all seek happiness in their life. It's just a miracle that we're here. It's a very empty, wasted universe. And it's amazing that none of us were kind of structured to all get together and live in a 7 billion person or 8 billion person world. Just 100 years ago, there was only 1 billion people, and 100 years before that, there's only like 100 million. So it's been an extraordinary journey. So first of all, just smell the roses, breathe deeply. And secondly, make your life as useful as you can.
Good thoughts. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Martine Rothblatt.